my pleasure to introduce Theo Wold. He is the director of the Administrative State Project at the Claremont Institute. He's the former Solicitor General for the state of Idaho and former Deputy Assistant to the President for Policy and Office of American Innovation in the Trump administration. Wold clerked at the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit for Judge Janice Rogers Brown and the United States District Court for the District of Puerto Rico for Judge Jose Antonio Fuste. Today, he'll be delivering an address called Governing Thyself, a Radical Manifesto. Please join me in welcoming Theo Wold.
Thank you for that introduction, and really thank you for having me here, students and faculty. You are a part of a new endeavor, building one of the premier academic institutions in the country, brick by brick. You should all feel very ennobled by what you are part of, and in some small way, I enjoy the same gratitude by being invited to speak to you today. So, I want to start about 2,000 miles from here, in what was once a prosperous and beautiful city, ornamented with all of the great decoration that a certain civilization could build or develop. A city that some anthropologists label a new Rome. A new Rome. It was described once as one of the most magnificent cities in the history of the world. The city was edged by flowering gardens that floated on rivers, lying on the shining flat waters of a shallow, irregular lake in the middle of a swamp. Straight, broad causeways connected the city to the shore, giving it into straight, broad avenues leading from the four directions of the new country. It had canals, it had great building projects, it had streets that were edged with ornamentation, gold, if you will. And there were palaces of civic undertaking in this great city. A traveler who visited this New Rome said, "We saw things so remarkable as not to be believed. We who saw them with our own eyes could not grasp them with any understanding." The city, as I said, is about 2,500 miles from where we are today. And as the story goes, after the ellipses, ... the city eventually was overtaken by degeneracy, vice, moral incontinence of the worst kind. So that traveler who visited the city, for all of those who fall into the simple rhetorical trap, was not discussing Washington, D.C. Hernan Cortez set foot in the capital of the Aztec Empire on August 8th, 1519. In a city we now call Tenochtitlan, which was the empire, the capital of the empire of the Nahuatl-speaking Aztecs. And Cortez knew of the place. He knew to take his men there from the Emperor Montezuma's coastal vassals, who described the city in flowering terms. Okay, so the capital of the Aztec Empire. Cortez arrives, and he's got probably altogether 300 Spaniards. He probably, according to the great Yale historian Prescott, had at most 3 front-loading cannons. And only his officers wore any armor. There were 15 horses altogether, just for captains. And there was a small pack of hunting dogs. The band was accompanied by some supportive allies, enemies of the Aztec nation. And in early November, they passed at about 13,000 feet between two volcanoes and made their way into the valley, where they sacked the city and conquered the Aztec nation. Remember, the Aztecs boasted an army in the field of about 145,000 warriors. They had, at most, in the city itself, an additional 85,000 troops that they could have called upon. All highly trained, all decorated from years, if not decades, of conflict with rivals in the region. And yet the Spaniards put their flag down and began administration of the capital the very same day that they arrived. And that's the question I want to put to you today. How? How did they do it? So, human flourishing. Burke, who I quite like, some of you may think of as a lesser philosopher, but I like him because he was engaged in what Cicero said, the life of practical politics, at the same time as philosophizing, something that appeals to me. Burke says, human flourishing is defined as norms of right living. And that norm of right living is knowable and discoverable by all human beings because it is inherent in human nature itself. We could spend an entire lecture unpacking that, but I want to put that out there as a proposition first, just an analytical lens. And the other lens to form your spectacles this afternoon is I want to remind you of the Aristotelian anthropology. I'm sure many of you have read Aristotle, right? Yes? All right. So we're by nature questioning, thinking, and most importantly, knowing animals, right? That track? We have bodies that have to be cared for. And the care of our bodies requires real goods, real things. Health, vitality, vigor, food, drink, shelter, those what modern psychologists call psychological goods, love, interconnected familial networks. And so Aristotle, and then some of you may say this is quite reductionist, but I've only got 30 minutes here, would say that we can think of human flourishing as happiness, right? The achievement of happiness, and not in sort of the shallow way that most of our contemporary society thinks of it, the accumulation of material goods, the emotive being happy, but rather a flourishing that's connected almost with the compatibility of life itself. Happiness is what we seek for its own sake and for the sake of no further good beyond it. So what was going on in the Aztec world when Cortez arrived? We've all heard the stories, right? And you can kind of find someone's intellectual bearing these days on how they might describe the Aztec nation. One category of folks will tell you, this is largely anthropologists and some scholars in the academy, will say, well, the Aztec nation was at the high point of civilization. They developed complicated mathematical schemes unknown to the Greeks. They had great architectural accomplishments in the construction of their temples and their civic buildings. They had an incredibly complex language, and some libertarian free marketeers will tell you they were the highest flourishing of a libertarian society. They had markets where they would exchange goods and trade services with rival nations in the region. Another camp will tell you that the Aztec nation was the height of barbarism. The Aztec nation practiced human sacrifice, that they engaged in a complex ritual of mutilating the human form, a belief that certain individuals, once designated by the priestly class, could become almost disembodied gods if you just made the correct mutilations. And what's so interesting is the third camp, where there's crossover between both of those two when it comes to how they may describe Hernan Cortez. Because it's almost a law, especially in public education in this country, to describe Cortez as nothing more than a ruffian, a barbarian who came upon a new Atlantis and destroyed it in a number of days, 4 days to be exact. So the last analytical lens that I want you to think about then is something that a great mentor of mine said, paraphrasing Chesterton, is actually the most precious commodity that any human being can ever only partially possess. And that's shorthand sanity, your ability to track with reality. So what is reality? Well, our ability to obtain those goods that I described earlier that are central to human flourishing depend on a number of factors. And the shorthand explanation I'd give you today is that those things that we need to flourish as human beings are only available to us insofar as we know what we ought to have, what's good for the human person. And as I said, we are, after all, a thinking animal. We act with a purpose. We strive to reach a certain goal, our telos, if you will. And yet there is in the exercise of our telos day to day a certain practical thinking that every human person must engage in. And the practical thinking of a sane human person tracks with reality. Goethe said once that all laws and moral principles at some level, at least those constructed by human hands, can be reduced to one simple law: the truth and your ability to correspond with it. So, as you can see, I'm building an implicit case here, if you will, for a form of the natural law. But before we really get too far along, let's go back to the Aztecs. So as I mentioned earlier, William Prescott, a great historian who built his reputation on a comprehensive study of the Aztecs, which is now denounced as essentially Western supremacy dressed up in some anthropology. He gave probably one of the best accounts of the Aztecs' entire civilization, the highest ritual at the center, which is of human sacrifice. And Prescott says, for certain festivals, a year before the intended sacrifice, a captive, usually a child, who was distinguished by his or her personal beauty and exemplary character, was selected by the priests in the high temple. And for that year, certain tutors would then take charge of the captive and instruct him or her how to perform their new part with grace and dignity. Eventually, the captive would be fitted and arrayed in splendid dress and regaled with incense and a profusion of sweet-scented flowers. When the captive was brought out into the marketplace, the captive would be attended by a train of royal pages, and crowds were expected to prostrate themselves before the captive and to treat the captive not as a potential sacrifice, but as a potentate, a prince or princess of the kingdom. In this way, sacrificial captives led an easy, luxurious life until the day of sacrifice arrived. The captive would be then stripped of their gaudy apparel and transported naked, first by barge and then by litter through the crowds to one of the central temples. And at the summit of the temple, the captive was stretched on a huge block of jasper. And 5 priests would secure the captive's head and limbs, and the 6th priest would then dexterously open the chest of the captive and, inserting his hand in the wound, tear out the palpitating heart for the crowd to witness firsthand. So a hero of the modern left and widely considered the father of multilateral or international law, Bartolomé de las Casas. He was a Dominican priest of the time. And what's interesting about de las Casas is he laid out the case for human sacrifice as being consistent with natural law. De las Casas said, no, you understand this all wrong, Christian Europe. You've got this backwards. Because we know from biblical teaching that men offer God what they hold to be most excellent. That our own kind, those who make up our nation, or as we would say today, our community, are usually what we hold out to be most excellent. As I said, even Abraham was ready to sacrifice his son Isaac, and God sacrificed his own. So what the Aztecs are doing is no different than what we do in the Christian West. Now, the Spaniards, that barbarian, that ruffian that I described, Hernan Cortez, they would come upon the remains of ritualistic killings that went beyond just the sacrifice of the designated captives. And then later, the Spaniards saw the killings for themselves, including the half-eaten remains of some of their comrades. Cannibalism was common among the Aztecs. And there's a great description in Cortez's letter to the Spanish king about how disgust, how moral revulsion led Cortez to break into the pens, as he described it, of where captives were held, and to release the captives, and then to begin storming the temples and tearing them down. What some modern anthropologists and historians call the rape of the Aztec nation. So, the Aztec religion commanded these deaths. They had a complex set of rituals and some kind of logic by which they explained their importance. The Christian religion in Europe forbade these things. And I think we could all agree with many of the theologians of the time, they saw these customs as crimes. The usual formulation that we're taught is that the Aztecs made sacrifices, the Spaniards committed genocide and massacred. Okay, so this is the heart of the moral dispute. This is the moral quandary. We're pitting the traditional practices of an entire people, an indigenous people, who we are told today reserve a special opprobrium, against the crimes of individuals transgressing the laws of their own civilization. And lest you think, well, that's kind of odd, you went back for a hypothetical several hundreds of years ago to impart to us only some kind of simplistic, not very profound teaching, Mr. Wold. Look, this isn't a new moral quandary. This is precisely the question that was at the heart of the Nuremberg trials. Whether the actions of the Nazi leaders were legitimate according to the positive law of their state. They said what they were doing was rightful, lawful, according to the nationalist socialist legislation of the time. And they couldn't be condemned, certainly not under any higher law, certainly not under any moral proposition that the British or the Americans were bringing to bear. So the basic question that we've got then is whether there are some basis, any basis, to condemn certain actions no matter what the civil law, no matter what organized society may tell you is acceptable, because their purpose, their end, runs contrary to a greater law. A hero of mine, you'll detect a theme here. I think he's a first-rate philosopher. Again, some of you may disagree with me. Cicero, again, a practitioner of both practical politics and a little philosophizing on the side. He's got this great quote, which some argue is not actually attributable to Cicero himself in De Publica, where he says, "True law is reason, and it's right and natural. It commands people to fulfill their obligations, and it prohibits and deters them from doing wrong. Its validity is universal, it is immutable and eternal. Its commands and its prohibitions apply effectively to good men, and those uninfluenced by them are bad. Any attempt to supersede this law, to repeal any part of it, is ultimately sinful. To cancel it entirely is impossible. Neither the Senate nor the Assembly can exempt us from its demands, no matter what they promulgate, and we need no interpreter or expounder of it but ourselves. There will not be one law at Rome, one at Athens, or one now, today, and one later, but all nations will be subject all the time to this one changeless and everlasting law." Okay, so human flourishing, human happiness, and reason, your ability to track with reality. Central questions that you're all going to have to confront in one way or another. And I'll tell you this, having advised a president of the United States for 3.5 years under some pretty tricky circumstances, there will not be any time to say, "Let me get back to you on that, sir. I'm going to go phone a friend, get my pastor on the line, maybe he can walk me through this one. I'm going to go do some research over at the Library of Congress, and we'll see what Jefferson had to say about this. I'm going to think about this for a few days, and I'll get back to you." Sometimes moral quandaries are actually presented in the moment itself. And there is no greater opportunity. There is no phoning a friend. There is no research project available to you. And some of the questions are actually quite tricky, or at least on their face they are. So, look, you could say, well, that Wold, he's a product of Western civilization, kind of patriarchal of him to look askance at the Aztecs, because that's my implication. I am. If that wasn't clear. What does he know? What does he know? And the Aztecs, that's an easy question. It's not like we engage in the ritualistic murder of innocent life, not in our society. I've argued with a few federal judges who think otherwise. It's not like we engage in the mutilation of the human body to create disembodied gods that are neither male nor female. We don't do that. And it's not like we engage in any practice where we would put people through the performative art of having to confirm a reality we all know to be untrue. We don't do that. Here's the news I've got for you all, and this exempts your faculty, not because they're too aged or decrepit, but these are questions I can assure you that none of us had dreamt of. Matters that will confront the human soul that were not dreamt of in our wildest nightmares, that lay before all of you as students today, engaged in the hard process of getting to the truth in your studies, right? Wrestling with texts, wrestling with some of the great conversations, because they are conversations, they're not debates. No one pitted Nietzsche against Plato. They didn't enter a ring somewhere and start shadow boxing. It's a conversation because the ideas are there. They're there for you. And you don't need an interpreter, you don't need a guide. You can suss it out. But they are a conversation because it is ongoing. It's ongoing. So you will have to engage in the fullness of this debate, this discussion, this conversation that you will have with your contemporaries, with your peers, who do not have the luxury of being educated at a place like this. And some of the presuppositions that you take into those conversations are wholly and entirely unknown to your peers. Completely unknown. And so the question then becomes for all of you, how will you explain it? How will you explain it? That child sacrifice is wrong here in this country, just as it was wrong in Central America yesterday, and just as it is wrong tomorrow in Vietnam. How will you explain it? How will you explain that that precious commodity, in Chesterton's words, sanity, and your correspondence with reality makes it so that you cannot be compelled to use preferred pronouns? Right? For me, it's a real thing. It's a choice that you have to make as a practitioner, as a professional. Am I going to get sanctioned by this judge and potentially lose this case, or am I just going to elide the point and use the preferred pronouns? It's not hypothetical, and it's not a war to insult someone's dignity. Am I going to efface reality and my commitment to the truth to make it easier to do that basic human flourishing, to have a job, to make some money, to feed my kids? We can all discuss at some level, pick your author, whoever that may be, Solzhenitsyn, Orwell, pick your favorite dystopic novelist of the last century. We are living in those times. Those are the times unto which you were born. Men and women have so mismanaged their precious commodity. They have sold it, they have traded it, they have given it away to the swineherd for a few shekels. That what is now before you is trying to persuade people who have lost all connection to reality itself. Your lexicon and your vocabulary isn't about convincing people who are familiar with the same texts that you've spent years reading. Your lexicon and vocabulary have to be fitted for people who don't even know what Scripture is, let alone what it contains. So, I'll give you the little reveal that I haven't done before in this lecture. I've given something like this once before, and I'll tell you, I wasn't asked back. Which is, I actually think the hero of the story is Cortez. And sure, I will allow for the fact that maybe he makes himself a bit of the hero in his correspondence with the king. He's puffing up his resume, if you will. And I'll allow for the fact that Cortez may have had subsidiary interests in the New World, the achievement of a personal fortune or fortune for the king. But he also had an inborn notion of honor. He had also cultivated old virtues that are so easily insulted or disgraced in our modern society. Loyalty to his men, fidelity to the mission itself, strength both of physical body and of spiritual, moral courage, character. And also, he had that faculty which I charge all of you to develop. should be common to all human persons, basic human revulsion. He saw something disgusting and it was revolting, and he acted on it. He didn't say, shoot, I guess I won't visit Berkeley anymore. He didn't say different strokes for different folks. I thought today was July 4th. This is a different type of festival. He didn't say, I don't want that for my kids, but what they care to do, that's their own choice. He didn't say, let bygones be bygones. He said, that's a moral wrong, and it will be to the depreciation of my own soul if I ignore it. And then he acted. He destroyed it. So, the drama of human existence then comes down to the fact that human beings can choose or reject the right thing. And without this freedom, of course, there'd be no meaning to a law of precisely a human and rational nature. And on the other hand, freedom with no relation to law, to a fitting order, without grounding in reality, could produce all manner of evil. Governing thyself, then, is a radical project, especially in a society that longs for no governance at all. So, I'll end here with this then. The challenge for all of you then, and I'm sure some of you have already picked up this mantle, you're hard at work as it is to take personal responsibility for your own moral development. Listen to your pastors, read your scripture, have an active and engaged prayer life, and develop that palate, maybe for some of you, for fine wine, I hope not, but a palate for the higher moral things of human existence. So when the time comes, and the President of the United States says to you, there are these bills that are popping up all around the country, and they are bills that our friends are writing. They're happening in places like Tennessee and Texas. And they say that only women can play women's sports. What do you all think of it? Should I talk about that? And the chief counsel to the president, the White House counsel, says, no, sir, you shouldn't talk about that. It's not really that popular of an issue. It's going to hurt you with a lot of swing voters. And these are our friends. They're in places we've already won. Leave it alone. The next is the political advisor to the president, one of the senior political advisors to the president, and he says, the White House counsel's right. Leave it alone. And then we go to one of the president's senior advisors, close senior advisor to the president, one of his most trusted aides, and the senior advisor says, I think this whole trans thing is a giant fad. It'll be gone in just a couple of months. Don't waste any time. Don't waste any rhetoric on it. It'll burn itself out. Theo, what do you think? And just remember, there is no more lonely place in the world, no more isolating experience than to be a dissenting view in the Oval Office. You want to see groupthink? Don't be the guy or gal who runs contrary to the presentation that's been offered, especially by folks who are your senior. So to all of you who are building this institution brick by brick, who are taking a new approach, a new ancient approach to learning, to all of you who will be called upon to regenerate the flames of our civilization and also to keep them kindled, I ask you, what's your advice? What would you tell the president to do? Thank you. Thanks for having me, folks. Thank you.
So the relationship between our own society and the Aztecs is a scary one, and it seems undeniable, the picture that you painted. Why are we talking about Aztec society? Oh my goodness, we're living in Aztec society. And then you're talking about the natural law. So Aquinas, eternal law. Beneath that, you have natural law and divine law, both informing human law. Particularly given your background in the White House, I'm interested in the question. Let's assume that there is the courage and the fortitude necessary in this young generation, because that's, I think, what you really need. If you're asked the questions by the president, they're just going to need fortitude and courage.
Yeah.
Let's assume that's there and talk technique. You have natural law arguments, you have Bible law arguments that I think both play, Aquinas thinks both play, in informing the president, informing statute, all of that. My first question is not just which we should use or how we should use each one, but what's the appetite in DC? What's the appetite for modern man in a secular humanist society like our own that's lost its sense of the natural law? What is their appetite for natural law arguments? Not Bible, just when you try to explain something about natural law and convince and persuade along lines of natural law, is there any taste bud for that, or is it all pragmatics?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is be wary of any politician or leader who tells you that they're just pragmatic, right? That's like that's the go-to salesman line for modern American politics is, well, I don't want to get into that. I'm just a pragmatic thinker. I'm just practical. And that's kind of the watchword of most figures in DC. I would say the how is in some part, you've got to accept that you are essentially a missionary. You are a pilgrim in an unholy land at some level. So when you calibrate that way, and you think, well, this is a United States senator, and he quotes scripture all the time. Right, the same 3 pieces of scripture all the time. But when you recalibrate it and you say, okay, this is the chieftain of a people, and he's unfamiliar with the teachings of my civilization. And I should break it down for him in a way that he can understand. You can have some success that way. You really can. So the natural law, there are certain principles that will resonate. Getting past groupthink and sort of societal pressure, well, they'll call us mean. I had a mentor once, a great natural law theorist, John Finnis, who said to me, the thing about your generation, what your Achilles weakness is that you're all preoccupied with not being mean. And it's why you'll win the abortion debate ultimately, because science has given you kind of a plus up. It's given you augmentation for the fortitude you lack. Because when people see the sonogram and they see the image and they can draw that inference that, wow, that is a human life, they don't want to be mean, right? You're being mean to this innocent, unprotected little thing. But it's the exact same reason why you will lose all of the other debates on marriage, on the nature and being of human biology, because you will fear being called mean. The octogenarian lesbian who just wants to marry. The girl who just wants to play boys' sports and wear boys' clothing. Don't be mean. So I think you're right about fortitude, but it's not just so easy as like, well, I talk to my friends and we all read the same stuff and we have strength and we have courage and we agree. It's really about inculcating a sense of being a dissident, if you will. And I look, and I'll tell you, I mean, I'm wearing a monkey suit today, but look, being a dissident is cool, right? Like, you get to wear the leather jacket now. Like, you get to wear the sunglasses to class and say, hey, teach, that's Aquinas, bro, right? So being a dissident has always been cool, and they left that to us. And now you get to be the best kind of dissident, which is one who actually has something to say.
Yeah. In a particular kind, I mean, Cortez is that in a sense when he enters in, but they were doing their child sacrifices center stage, public platform on the temples.
Yeah.
we do our child sacrifice in the corners still. We haven't.
Yeah.
And so to actually go in, you really do have to expose the works of darkness here. So I'm wondering tactically, for those who are interested in entering into, say, either political theory, political actual work on the ground. Now let's talk about both those tools. You leaned on natural law. And we want to say yes, natural and Bible law in these scenarios. How do you use each one of those weapons when you're actually looking to persuade public opinion, when you're trying to persuade those with whom you're working? How have you employed both of those?
Well, I'll give you how you all are already doing it, right? I come in, and what is the thing that you're doing together? You're singing. A profound expression of our civilization. And you're making music, which is really essentially a lexicon of the soul. Break it down one step further. What do I mean by that? I mean, you've got to be able to make culture. And we could talk about what is culture and get into all these sort of esoteric definitions. What is culture? It's that thing we do as human beings together, right? I mean, it's that thing. And what do? We listen to Taylor Swift, and we smoke dope, and we eat at fast food. That's our culture, right?
Those three always go together.
Always. Always. I was talking to a guy the other day about he was asking me, were you involved in the Greenland purchase? And I said, I was around and I went to a couple of the meetings. It wasn't my idea. And he said, I'm not going to lie. I think it would be great vis-a-vis China to have Greenland as a part of the Union. Strategically, it's important for us. But I really don't want Greenland to be a part of the United States, because what will it become? Welfare programs, on-demand abortion, fast food franchises, and really ugly buildings. That's your culture. That's your culture, or the culture around all of you. So the how do you do it is the first thing I would say to all of you here, whether you want to be someone who makes culture, makes music, makes beautiful things or not, the one thing that you can do today that you can take seriously is learn to write. Learn to write. If you have no other skill, that will be employable from now until the day the Republic actually falls. And why? It was on display to me just a few weeks ago. I mean, I was in an officer training school in the Air Force with all these people who have different accomplishments and things, and we had to write a basic memo, 4 paragraphs long, basic memo. And do you know how most people wrote their memo? ChatGPT, right? Right? I mean, and to me, it's kind of like it's a challenge, right? It's like a schoolyard taunt. The computer is basically saying, I can be more human than you can. Because that expression of the soul, that capacity that allows you to speak about your own being in connection to reality, to put words to paper, to express meaning, you're willing to give that over to a computer. To a computer, there's nothing more effacing of being a human than that. So you make culture because then you can explain the natural law. You can explain scripture, not because you say, well, Pastor Longshore said so, or Pastor Wilson told me so, or this is true because Aquinas said it. But you write a short story, right? A Gothic short story. And it reveals something about the nature of families. Or you make a short film about what it means to be a mother, right? And now what you have learned from your faculty is impregnated in that piece of art, in that essay that you have published. It's all there. But you didn't lead by saying, well, as we know from the book of Exodus, it's there. And that's part of the act of being a dissident, is ferrying things across enemy lines and putting those ordinances where they're going to least expect it, and then watching them go off. And then persuading those people there is something better than what you know. There's something better, and let me show you more.
Last question, and I got to be careful with this one, but we've had a couple conversations. You've seen the lay of the land. You've been in the White House, done all that stuff on a national level. You've done stuff on the state level. And I've heard you say things about NSA. Now, I don't want you to just puff us up.
Yeah.
Don't do that. So shoot straight. But given what you've seen in our nation, in our debased mind, and what you know about this Reformed evangelical community and this liberal arts Christian college, really, I think a lot of the students don't quite know what is happening on the grander scheme and where NSA fits in. Can you just say, here's what God's doing, here's... Yeah,
so 3 things. Regardless of how you ended up here, You chose it, or someone said, hey, we don't know what to do with you. Go play on the freeway or go down to New St. Andrews. However you ended up here, at some point, you're going to encounter the Credential Mafia, right? And they run the world. I mean, there are members of the United States Supreme Court who are there now just because they have the right credentials. And the Credential Mafia will make you feel bad, because eventually it will be implicit, but then eventually someday it will become explicit. You didn't get this job because you don't have the right credentials. You didn't get selected for this position because you don't have the right credentials. Here's what I want to tell you about that. So that's going to happen at some point for all of you. The important thing that you need to know is you have the best credential possible. You have a free education, free as in you have been freely allowed to explore all ideas. A free education grounded in capital T truth, where you are not only encouraged, but you are guided in developing a meaningful faith life, okay? The last part about this, painting the picture grand scale, is to say that all the other educational institutions out there, nearly all, I think there's probably three or four, and I'm not exaggerating, 3 or 4 that are actually engaged in the enterprise of being a university. I mean, think of that, right? I mean, a university was founded to ensure the survival of certain texts, the promulgation of certain ideas, and the exchange of rigorous, what Kant called the mutual antagonism of good ideas, right? Like the mutual antagonism, that back and forth between teacher and student, or student and student, to arrive at the truth. I would say in America, at least, and Europe is largely a dead letter. I studied there, and there's probably 2 institutions, but here in the United States, there's probably 4 institutions left that are real, meaningful universities in the fullest sense of that word. So what does that mean for all of you? Well, I mean, for St. Benedict, it's basically like, there's 4 monasteries left. And we're the only ones who are going to preserve this knowledge. And what is this knowledge? What is this knowledge? I mean, people always say that all the time. Well, Western civilizations, in its decline, or people will forget how to do these things. I'll just give you a quick anecdote. I was in Malta once, and I was talking to a Maltese farmer, and I said, every single one of your churches here in Malta is so elaborate and so ornate. You have just like this basic country church, and it's, gilded, and it's got these domes. What's with the domes in Malta? Everything has a dome. And he said, well, the interesting thing about the domes is because we were quite proud when most of Europe literally forgot the basics of architecture as inherited by the Greeks. We were the last place to be practicing these refined civilizational decorations. And then the Muslims came and they took it from us. You can literally forget how to do certain things. Or to give you a more modern, contemporary example, a 3-star general in the United States Air Force recently requested from Congress that we go through and revisit our entire nuclear arsenal. Why? Most of our ICBMs were constructed in the 1960s and updated as we went along, and the engineers now have no idea how to retrofit our nuclear arsenal. We have no one who can figure out how to work with basic copper and rewire the things. We need new ones because we lost the knowledge on how to care for the old ones. We need new knowledge, new things, because we lost the knowledge to care for old things. That is what you must do, right? So it's great, pat yourself on the back. I got into New St. Andrews, I really liked it. We have good friends, Moscow's a cool city. Here's the bad news, guys. It's on you. You don't read Aristotle. You don't actually take the time to understand the intricacies of the Constitution. No one else is. And if you want to live with barbarians, then major in fine wine while you're here and don't take your studies seriously. If you want to live in a civilization, ain't nobody else going to do it but you guys.
Join me in thanking Theo Wold.